Today we head to New England and stop into a basement studio to pick on a classic rock and roll band. Turn it up because you're going to want to hear every note from Boston.
What does it take to see? It's a heart and soul, a gentle hand. So come down, come see. You don't wanna wake and believe.
I love that Hammond sound, and it was the best sound coming out of your stereo speakers in late summer of '76. Boston.
Visiting Boston, this beautiful city has so much to offer.
Very funny. The band Boston was designed and invented from an engineer's perspective. That engineer, Tom Sholt. Sholt is a graduate of MIT, with his formative years spent playing piano with Beethoven and Chopin until he heard the Kinks. Then he picked up the guitar when he heard Jeff Beck and Jimi Page. He picked through their work and found it was quite a challenge, which Tom really dug, so he kept up practicing with Jim and Jeff, and then started writing songs with Beethoven melodies and Led Zeppelin power chords colliding in his head like the Hadron Collider smashes atoms. But he heard these chords with the mind of an engineer. He was always looking for the right wavelength in those power chords. The fuzz boxes off the shelf at the local music store just didn't cut it, so Sholt started building his own studio devices and hooking them up to his Hammond B3 and his Les Paul guitars. In 1969, Sholt was working for Polaroid during the day and building a basement studio workshop at night in his Watertown rented apartment. He crammed the drums, the Hammond organs, the Leslies, the guitar amps into every single square inch of his basement. And according to Sholtz, every Boston album has been created in one of his basement studio workshops. Also in 1969, Tom started gigging with a band called Freehold with guitarist Barry Goudreau and drummer Jim Mastia. Tom invited Barry and Jim down to his wood-paneled Watertown basement studio to hear some of his stuff. The two were impressed. They saw the Cramps set up and heard Tom's ideas about music and getting a record deal. Now, what musician wouldn't love to work in a sandbox like that? In 1970, they decided they wanted a vocalist, so they auditioned a bunch of them and decided finally on Brad Delp to join them to round out Freehold and record in Tom's basement. Between 1970 and 72, tapes were produced and sent out to numerous record companies with no success. Freehold morphed into a band called Mother's Milk and kept playing the local Boston and Cape Cod gigs while Tom worked on new audio devices and wrote songs down his basement. Then one day in 1973, Sholtz came up with the hyper-space guitar pedal, and that became the signature Boston sound. So the four musicians continued to make demo tapes into 1975, and it was during these sessions that sprang up More Than a Feeling and 5 other Boston tunes that would become mega hits. The Mother's Milk songs finally caught the interest of 2 promoters, and they brought them to Epic Records. Now, Epic had already rejected the Mother's Milk demo tapes in the past, but took a second listen based on the strength of the promoter's pitch. Epic's second listen produced thumbs up, but they also were concerned about the tapes were just tricks of a studio engineer in the basement. They wanted to hear a live band before putting any record deal to paper. And they also wanted the drummer replaced. They were not impressed with Jim Mastia. So back in Massachusetts, Sholtz threw together a live band. As for the drummer problem, some rock bios have Mastia leaving before the epic demands to pursue other interests, while others had him just being fired. And you're mean. Anyway, the Mother's Milk Band was now Brad Delp on vocals, Sholtz on Hammond organs and guitar, Barry Goudreau also on another guitar, and they brought in Fran Sheehan on bass and Sib Hashian on drums. And with this group, they passed the epic live audition. Then the record company wanted the demo tape re-recorded in LA with their producers. Well, Sholtz wanted no part of any other engineers besides himself messing with his invention. So he hired a producer to help run interference with the record company. John Boylan, who had worked with Ricky Nelson and Linda Ronstadt, just to name a couple, did a great job creating the ruse. The vocal tracks were done in LA, but most of the first album and all other Boston albums were 90% produced by Sholtz in his basement workshop studio. The name Boston came from the producer Boylan and engineer Warren Dewey sitting around late one night listening and thinking that Mother's Milk was not really the right name for this band. They came up with Boston. After all, there was a band called Chicago. Thanks, all right, you guys have had your Under the Classic Rock time. The first Boston album was released in August of 1976. The debut Boston album is one of the best-selling debut albums of all time. 17 million sold. Only Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction sold better at a mere 18 million. The original Epic record deal was for 10 albums. From 1976 to 2013, only 6 Boston albums have been produced.
That's not going to be good for business. That's not going to be good for anybody.
Yeah. In 1976, the record company and the promoters wanted to keep the fact that Boston was really the creation of one man. The story worked on the fan level, but it did not work on the leader of the band, Tom Sholt. It was Scholt's detailed, compulsive, exacting style of producing that kept the pace of new Boston material at a snail's pace, and really the reasons for numerous lawsuits from managers and record companies.
I got no time for wasting. I got to live my life while I can.
Boston's second album in 1978, Don't Look Back, took 2 years to get out, and Scholtz still considered it a rush job. Does not like the album. Third Stage took another 8 years to complete, and so on, right up to 2013's Life, Love, and Hope.
Whenever I start to wonder, the things you say, the words I read.
None of the albums came anywhere near the sales achieved by the first Boston album. Personnel have come and gone. Lead singer Brad Delp committed suicide in March of 2009, and drummer Sib Hashian has also passed away. Scholtz continued to tinker in his studio workshop while working on Boston material, and also came up with a line of headphone amplifiers and other guitar gear under the name of Rockman. And I'm sure you guitarists know exactly the stuff I'm talking about. As of 2017, Boston still goes out and performs and packs them in. All great music and sounds from a kid who grew up in Toledo, Ohio, tinkering with his tricycles and anything else he could get his hands on. Some true and false before we land this Boston spaceship. True, original Mother's Milk drummer Jim Mastia did play on Rock and Roll Band on the debut album. Sib Hashian played on the remainder of the tunes. More Than a Feeling was the first song written for the first Boston album. False, it was Foreplay. That was the first song written for the album, and supposedly was Scholt's first song he ever wrote. You can hear and download Under the Classic Rock on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, Player FM, and on iHeartRadio. And please, when you can, share this podcast with all your classic rock friends. And I thank you for listening and downloading Under the Classic Rock, and we'll talk to you soon.